and I loathe these discussions. The argument of the village atheist whose single passion is to revile endlessly that which he denies the existence of in the first place. Your fellowship is a fellowship of pain and nothing more.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot, the podcast by storytellers for storytellers so that we can tell better stories ourselves. As always, I'm your host, Maverick, and today we have back with us one of our favorite guests, Andrew Reeder, to review The Sunset Limited, a 2011 film, which was the screenplay was by Cormac McCarthy, and it was directed by Tommy Lee Jones. So, before we get into the overall thoughts of the film, as always, we want those initial impressions. What do people think when they first see this? Andrew, take it away. What are your thoughts on The Sunset Limited?
I think this is a very different movie. It's not structured in the way that you normally would structure a movie, considering the entire thing is a dialogue. And I think it causes the viewer to kind of interrogate some very philosophical and thought-provoking questions, both during the movie and afterwards.
Yeah, no, it's definitely very philosophical. Some films are like that, right? There's a lot of, especially the Christopher Nolan films, for example, have a lot of ideas and themes and some philosophical concepts that are thrown around a lot in those. So you get a real meaty example of that in this film. So if you want that kind of thing, if you like that kind of thing, you get that in large helpings in this film. So great for that regard. It's very different. I think it will be an interesting analysis just from my perspective on how effective is dialogue in pushing the story forward, and the benefits and drawbacks of those kinds of things compared to, say, action. Does action really push plots forward, right? So I think there's a lot in store here that has a lot of interest for viewers and for people who are thinking about how to tell a compelling story, right? Is dialogue in and of itself sufficient, and what it does for the audience, all that kind of stuff. So I'm looking forward to it. But before we get into the discussion, Andrew, we need to know what The Sunset Limited is about.
I'm going to be honest. Part of what I want to talk about is this, but to give a brief overview, the general understanding of the movie is that this is a story of a man who has lost all hope and attempted to commit suicide. And the movie picks up with him being confronted by the man who prevented him from committing suicide. These two characters are black and white. It's pretty descriptive of who they are. And black is an ex-con who saved white, who is an atheistic professor who has lost all hope in life. And the entire movie follows their dialogue where black is trying to convince white to no longer want to kill himself.
Yeah. That's a pretty good summary of the film, and that's what you get for a full hour and a half. It's a pretty interesting that you can have a dialogue go on for that long in a film and still keep the movie going, but I'd say overall they do fairly decent. But that's what we're about to find out. Andrew, based off of the 9 points rating system, what did you give The Sunset Limited?
Let me pull up my review right now. I gave it a 6.9.
Okay, so that's a pretty solid rating. It's some real speaks from Andrew, who is not unwilling to trash a film. Myself, I gave it a 4.4, so right down the road in the middle. I thought there were some really good things going for it, but I definitely saw some serious drawbacks. I could be convinced otherwise, which is what's going on today. So let's start off this film. At the very beginning, you see two people sitting at a table in a apartment, and one of them is trying to leave and the other one won't let him. And then you find out Mr. Black stopped Mr. White from killing himself. What was your thoughts on the opening of this film?
I think I'm going to say this a lot with this movie is it's very different. Now, I will grant you, the opening of the film is not that unique in terms of like an opener for a film. It's more so how the film plays itself out. But I think for an opener, the very first few seconds they do enough to catch your attention. When I first watched this movie, I didn't know exactly what I was getting myself into. I didn't even watch the trailer. I know I got you to watch it first, but that was more because I had never seen the trailer and I wanted to see what it was like. um, and so yeah, I think that the initial dialogue is enough that it's intriguing. I also think it's very interesting that the word suicide is not really thrown around for at least like I think the first 30 minutes of the
Mm-hmm.
movie. It's very much implied, but I think they do a very good job of showing and not telling what happened leading up to the very beginning sequence.
Yeah, and it's very natural, right? Because you see them in the middle of a discussion. They're back at
Yeah.
Black's place, and Black is trying to confront him in a kindly way, trying to encourage him to think about what is his reasons for doing this, his reasons for living, and all of that kind of stuff, right? And this is getting a little bit ahead, but this is the setting that you come into as the audience, and they do very good at both catching you up without doing a monologue of, oh, this is what happened before, this is how we got to where we are today, blah blah blah. If you just watched Venom in our recent review, you got a lot of that monologue explaining, and you really don't get that at all in this film, right? It's a lot of you trying to put together the pieces of what happened before while still being given all the pieces to do so. So they do very well with that. And I think starting you off right in the middle of the action with him trying to leave, right? And then Black goes, oh, I'm going to go with you. And White goes, well, why do you need to do that? And this whole discussion, right, is you have enough pieces lying around that you as the audience are going, I'm really curious what is like why does he want to leave so desperately, right? And so I thought the beginning was compelling enough to get you invested as the audience to at least see what's going on.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think going back to your point about it being natural, I definitely would agree with this, mostly because like when you think about the conversation that they had, you have the fact that their dialogue is very much akin to how you would interact with someone post that. You wouldn't go throwing around the word suicide, but you would also be referring to things that happened in that scenario. And little by little, someone who's listening in on this conversation can pick up, oh, this is what you're talking about. Even if they weren't there themselves, and even if they're not given all of the details, they have a good enough picture to figure out what happened.
Correct. Yeah. What are your thoughts on the protagonist and well, so who's this is the question. Which one do you think is the protagonist before we get too deep into this? Is it Black or is it White?
I think it's both, but I would probably argue the protagonist here. Well, this is why this movie is so interesting and why I enjoy it. Is there are so many different ways you could take this movie, um, and I think it makes for a good thought experiment outside of the philosophical arguments that are being presented. And one of those is the movie could be taken a completely different way depending on who you interpret the main character to be. Um, and so, if you take this to be a movie about Black, this is in his mind a challenge sent to him by God. It's a test, and
Mm-hmm.
he is here to save his brother. In like he calls them at the beginning of the movie, right? He says, "You don't look like my brother, but I decided I needed to look again." When he's talking about like his when he first interacted with him at the beginning, like when he sees him on at the train station. Whereas if you take this to be a movie about White, the challenge that he's faced with is this person trying to prevent him from taking his own life. It's this person preventing him from finding ultimate peace, right? And he describes death as the ultimate end, quiet, as if the noise of life is this horrible hell that he's living through.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Do you and your argument is kind of like it's both. Is it because you see both of those themes or because you think that one is truly dominant over the other or simply neither is dominant over the other? What is your thoughts?
I think the thing is both of them are just as prominent as the other, and both of them represent a diametrically opposed worldview, and so both of them are trying to achieve a goal. Now, the problem is, I think they both have different things going for them, and this is a problem you have when you're trying to tell a story, but you basically have two protagonists. And that's like when we look at Black, he grows as a character, I would say, but he doesn't accomplish his goal. And
Hmm.
well, actually, that's a whole nother discussion. I would say there can be an argument made for the fact that he doesn't accomplish his goal.
Hmm.
Now that comes down to what was his goal in the movie, and from
Right.
his perspective, there's two ways you can take that. And I don't mean to go on a bunch of rabbit trails here, but there's a lot to parse out. Um, and so the first thing you need to consider is, all right, was his goal to dissuade White from committing suicide, or was his goal to do the Lord's will, which is what he claimed it was in the movie? And if his goal was simply to serve God in this movie, then he would have accomplished that goal. He was a good and faithful servant. Despite the fact that White does end up leaving the apartment in the end, he still did what he was meant to do.
Yeah, and I guess that even in and of itself is a whole philosophical discussion because, okay, yeah, I can see how this could get real rabbit trailed real fast.
Yes, very much.
So that's a fair analysis, I think, um of Black's motives, right? I
Yes.
think what we should do is let's go back to White and you can finish up on analyzing what his are, and then let's just go straight into White's thought process and like analyzing his character, and then we'll come back to Black and finish his.
Yeah. With White, remember I said they both have things you're lacking and they both have things they bring to the table.
Mm-hmm.
Black, you could argue, doesn't accomplish his goals, but I would argue he does grow as a character because in the end, he kind of has that moment where he's talking to God and he's like, "Is this what you want from me? Where was I supposed to go? Like, I feel like I failed you." Um, but White, on the other hand, what is his goal in the movie? To leave the apartment. That is the thing he's constantly trying to do. It's not necessarily to go commit suicide. It's to get through that door and to leave. And by the end of the movie, he does accomplish that. He gets out the door and he leaves. And it's kind of left open to interpretation whether or not he goes to kill himself or not. Black's reaction is very much that he pretty much believes he's going to kill himself anyways. And I would personally argue it's pretty safe to assume he does kill himself because there's no change in his attitude towards the idea of suicide. If anything, he's being able to express it verbally to Black and kind of like he's even like, yeah, I do like this idea even more than I did when I first tried it. And it's very different than most. Like if you look at like people who have survived suicide, a lot of them will say like, as soon as I committed the act, like say they jump off a bridge, as soon as I jumped off the bridge, I realized, what am I doing? White is the example of a person who did take that leap and didn't regret it. He is fully committed to the idea of suicide is the answer here, and he doesn't change his mind, which is I think it's reasonable to assume he does commit suicide. So regardless of what you think his goal was to leave the room or to commit suicide, I would argue he still accomplishes that goal in the end.
Yeah, it's definitely inferred, I would say, and I would argue that the inference of suicide is likely the correct one, right? Where he goes, I want to do this, and the whole discussion with Black is Black's attempt to cause him to rethink and to discover deeper meaning in his own life. And the further he goes, the more that you see this anger and bitterness, or even a certain degree of complete apathy with the world that is revealed in his thought process to a degree that there is nothing left to hold on to. And that's not in a despairing sense, but it's simply an acceptance of that fact. So that he's now at this point, it's almost like he comes to the conclusion by the end of the film that this is okay. We've thought this through. This is what I've come to a conclusion I must do. Now let's do it. And he's like, I need to leave now because there's no further point for discussion. So it's interesting, definitely. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, that's all I have to say on that. I wouldn't generally go toward that. He's just trying to leave the room because obviously he has a lot deeper thoughts behind that. Um, but yeah, I would say it's probably safe to say he accomplished his goal there. Um,
Yeah, but I think even if your goal seems on its head simplistic, the motivations behind it can be much deeper. Like, oh, your goal in the movie in Star Wars Episode 4 is just to blow up the Death Star. Okay, why is that your goal is a different question than what is your goal.
sure. Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I guess that's a fair point. It's not like just because he wants to leave the room, that in and of itself is a dumb goal or is not his goal. Um, I still
Yeah.
don't think that that's actually his goal, is simply to leave the room. And that's made clear in the discussions that everyone knows what he's going to do, right? Because he
Yeah.
says, "Oh, why do you need to come with me?" No, 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 you can't come with me. In that case, I'm going to stay here. And then he's like, "I'm going to go home." And he goes, "Don't go." He says, "What if I promise I'm not gonna, go to the train station again?" He goes, "Well, basically, I don't believe you. I think you might go anyways." And so, there's this whole point where, and that goes back to the meaninglessness they had just discussed, right? Where White has said if he makes a promise, but he doesn't believe that anything of value is maintained in the world, what does it matter if he makes a promise he won't keep? Because he and the rest of the world is going to hell in a handbasket anyways. So
Yeah.
you see a lot of the nihilism in how White discusses everything, and Black recognizes that to a full degree, so that he knows that anything that he says about leaving and staying true to life or trying to stay alive is simply not to be taken at face value.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what were your thoughts on the philosophical discussion? And do you think that the philosophical discussion was a great way to, because obviously, right, you have, before I say that, right, you have these characters introduced in the film. Clearly he tried to commit suicide and was stopped, and they're trying to find a reason to keep him alive, right? That's a pretty significant, serious deal here. And from there they go into discussion on what the meaning of life even is and why they should even do this to begin with. Do you think that discussion is great at captivating the audience, at raising the stakes, at creating good themes? Like, what are your thoughts on all of those things?
I think it depends on the audience you're going for. This is not a movie that is going to entertain someone who wants to see action sequences. It is like the opposite of John Wick. You are not getting it's not a murder hobo, it's not murder porn. This is a philosophical discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And despite the fact that I think this isn't like a amazing movie, I think it does very, very well in the themes department and
Mm-hmm.
exploring ideas and flushing them out very well. Maybe a
Yeah.
little too much in the sense that you kind of lose other areas of like storytelling, because this is more of a dialogue than telling a story in and of itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah. 100%.
This is why it still gets a good amount of points for me, because I think when you're in a movie, one of the most important things is what message are you trying to convey in that movie? And John Wick isn't conveying a message. It is simply there for self gratification and for you to witness some epic action sequences. It's not necessarily telling a story or exploring a theme per se, as well as this movie would. And so, in terms of the themes, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that before I get into the themes
I mean,
themselves.
no, I think that that's a worthy discussion. And one of the points that it maybe takes away from me to a certain degree is that and I will say that I really like themes. I'm a big fan of thematic aspects to films, and when they play that out well, amazing. This film is very good at having strong themes, right, and very deep ideas being presented. Whereas there was a certain sense in which, and it was interesting just analyzing the film for the sake of the review, thinking about, okay, the themes were in some ways all over the place, because you have themes with white, you have themes with black, and they go into all these different facets of all of them in an hour and a half. And so in that case, it was almost too much in that area. But at the same time, you could also look at the film and say, what is the message of this? And I think the message is very clear, right? So I think that overall that they did that aspect of the film very well. I think that you can get too caught up in themes, though, and I think that this is one of the problems with this film, is that when you're taking someone through a story, you're taking them on an emotional journey, right? And the idea is to show them the rise and fall, not just of an idea, but the embodiment of that idea through a character, right? And I think they got so caught up in the idea in this discussion that they didn't actually go through much of, if anything, of a journey, right? And feel free to push back. This is why I said I would not be surprised if my rating went up after a compelling argument is made here. But my impression at this point is that the film itself does not really raise the stakes in any way for us as the audience. The discussion just continues on. And this is compared to, or it's alluded to, it is not compared to, but I believe it's intentionally hints to the story of Job, right? And maybe it's supposed to be a analysis of what something Job might have said or whatever. I don't know what the thoughts were with Cormac McCarthy when he wrote this, but there's definitely an idea that someone's despairing in their life in a way that Job certainly did. And what would the thought process or discussion with a good friend have been like if they went through that discussion? And while that thought process is interesting, like listening to a Joe Rogan podcast, right? A Joe Rogan podcast might be interesting, but I don't know that it's necessarily a compelling story per se. And so I think that it's interesting to see from a dialogue perspective and to have that discussion. And because it's caught in this framework of a man who's considering suicide, it adds some significant impetus to be involved in the plot. But to push it forward towards something, I don't know exactly what it's pushing toward to accelerate any stakes or involvement in the plot any more than it is at the beginning from the end of the film.
Yeah, I when filling out the 9 point system, the character development was something I definitely like. As I thought about it more and more, I think it is lacking in quite a few areas. I don't think you can make the argument that White really grows as a character. I think there are moments where he kind of almost seems to concede certain things,
Mm-hmm.
but at the end of the day, there's no real growth on his part. Black's character, I think, could have some growth, but I think his growth you'd need to see before and after the film. The film itself is kind of like a transition point for him. And when I think about the point of this film, I don't think it's meant to tell a story. I think at the end of yeah, I think it, and I'll admit that. Like as much as I enjoy this movie, I do not think that it is the type of movie where it is like, oh, we are telling the story in the same way we would any other movie. This is simply a dialogue meant to explore two diametrically opposing worldviews and what the
Right.
ultimate termination of those worldviews are in all practicality.
And I think that that's definitely I would agree 100% with that. I do think that they try to explore those very interesting ideas because everyone to some degree questions the idea of the meaning of life and why they should be here, and maybe not to the same degree of, oh, all of society is going to crap and I despair of all things. There's not necessarily that degree, but definitely at the very least contemplating life, right? And the meaning of life. And so going into that multifaceted aspect is very interesting. But in regards to creating a compelling plot, there's not much of one there. So, and that's part of why it's what, an hour and 15 minutes with 15 minutes of credits or 10 minutes of credits or whatever. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that is a significant hit, I would say, for me. Because if you don't have, and this is the reason this is important, right? Is not just to say, oh, it didn't fit this rating system that we made up so that it isn't actually a good story in this way, blah, blah, blah. No, it's because when you have a story, what you're trying to do is demonstrate value to the people that what is on stake is a big deal. And one of the ways you do that is not just say, oh, this is important, but show that it's important and then show what you're increasingly willing to sacrifice in order to maintain that ideal or maintain that goal. So, in the example of my favorite stereotype to bring up of an example on this podcast, here it comes, the Lord of the Rings, right? You see Frodo go from his home, but he sacrifices in the hope to destroy the One Ring, right? And he comes with this great company of people. Then he loses his mentor, right? Then he loses his entire troop that he's been following, who's been protecting him, right? Then at a certain point, he even loses his one and only ally, right? And then at one point, he even falls to the power of the ring itself, right? And there's other things along the way that also impact his journey, but there's increasing levels of sacrifice that he has to go through to prove that he's doing whatever it takes to try to achieve the story goal. And that in each step demonstrates the value of that he's willing to sacrifice more and more until he's willing to sacrifice everything, right? And that's part of the grand narrative that they're portraying there with J.R.R. Tolkien's work. Now, in this case, you don't have increasing value of sacrifice, and that's simply a technique, a storytelling technique to show us why something's important. And so I do think that it's actually relevant to this discussion in regards to the plot. That's all I had to say.
I mean, I don't have much to add there. He pretty much covered everything.
Cool. What are your thoughts on Black? Because you said that he had these two different ideas that he represented in the film. Yeah, you want to go into which one? Do you think one is more prevalent than the other in regards to his motive and his journey as a character? And for the audience, since we are just revisiting that, you want to restate those?
Say what? Because you said there's two. I don't remember saying there was two.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, you said there's like two different ways to take Black as a character. Either one, he's trying to stop White from committing suicide, or two, he's trying to obey God's will, right, in his life, or like be a good Christian witness, I guess.
Yes.
So you want to go into that? See, do you think one of those is there's a more compelling case for one than the other?
Yes and no. And let me explain. I think that Black, as a character, recognizes his job is to be a good and faithful servant. Mm-hmm. And that's why at the end of the movie, he's so torn. But he also has come to the point where he doesn't want to see White's character kill himself. And so he is almost in a way during the movie having this own internal conflict where he is like, yes, I want to do your will, but also, yes, please let me win out in this argument and convince this man not to kill himself. And you can see that in instances where it's like, he tells him, oh, I won't get offended. I'm just here to say this. And then he gets offended. Or he is basically telling Tommy Lee Jones' character, you can do what you want, but also you can't leave the apartment without me.
Right, yeah.
And he does get very argumentative with him to the point where it's like he's trying to win a debate rather than save White's character. And so I think Black's character throughout the movie is much more interested in simply preventing White from killing himself. And that's his whole motive in the movie, is to save this man's soul. But in the end, and I'm actually not sure how this plays out because I don't think it's very clear. You just end the movie with him like on the ground crying, like, I failed, I'm miserable. Was this really what you wanted from me? Why did you just have me spend an hour of my time talking to this guy for him to just leave? And so, I mean, that's kind of what I got from his character throughout this movie.
So you would generally take the stance that he did see his goal as to stop White from considering suicide any longer. Is that a fair analysis of that? And I'm not fully convinced on that, but I think I generally lean toward what you just said, because it's definitely, he says at the beginning, right, he listens to God and God basically tells him what he wants and he tries to listen for that, right? But at the same time, everything he's doing in his actions indicates he's trying to be almost the savior, if you will, of White, and to stop him from considering suicide any longer. And when he says at the end, I failed, or what would you have me do? Why couldn't I be more eloquent, right? Why couldn't I have all the answers like he did, right? And this despairing response is in some ways him coming to the realization that he can't do it, right? It's not his power that would result in the salvation of this man who is considering giving it all up, right? Instead, that it is that he needed God's intervention in this case to provide the, I guess, the mindset shift in White's mind that he would see value in his life beyond the despair that is forefront in his brain. So, yeah, I mean, I think that that's a fair analysis. Did you think that? What did you think of the the arc of him as a character? You think that that's compelling?
Well, here's the question I ended up asking myself during this movie, because now I'm analyzing it from the point of what was the plot here. Is do you need a character to have an arc for that character to be compelling? Um, and I think like an instance of certain characters that are in supporting roles is pretty good. I mean, the one I always go to when I think of like a supporting role that's very compelling, even though they don't truly have an arc, is Qui Gon Jinn. And I'm going to go to Star Wars because that's my go-to. Maverick likes Lord of the Rings. I like Star Wars, and I think Qui Gon Jinn is a great example of a supporting role. And granted, I think that White and Black both fill the roles of the protagonist as well as the supporting roles in this movie, um, because they kind of complement each other. You don't really have an None of them are a character in their own right. I want to say because they don't meet any challenges without the existence of the other, which makes for a very interesting film because most movies you have a protagonist who does function on their own. And sure, there are other characters who act as a stopping force to them. You have like a villain, but there's no real movie I can think of that both characters are kind of presented as the protagonist in their own right, and that they're not really bad guys, but as in like one of them is really an antagonist, but they're protagonists that function as the other protagonist antagonist, which that sounds really weird to say out loud, but it makes for a very interesting dynamic. And so the reason I bring up Qui Gon is because he's a character you have that has his own motivations, his own reasons for being there, his own development that you don't really see in the movie because he's gotten to the point where he's already made up his mind about who he is and what he wants out of the world. But he also still is able to convey a very compelling performance as a character throughout the movie. And you, as an audience member, are able to empathize with who he is and why he does the things that he does. And so that's why when it comes to like Black and White as characters, it's like sure they don't really, at least I don't think, especially White doesn't really have an arc. I think he can still be compelling as a character if that makes sense.
And it's been a minute since we reviewed Star Wars Episode 1. If you want to go back and check out that review, feel free. We go into it in depth. Now, my vague recollection of reviewing that episode is that we gave it pretty low marks. And that was surprising for me because I remembered loving the film when I was growing up as a kid and then rewatching it for the purposes of this podcast and going, crap, this movie is garbanzo beans. Why am I
Yes, this.
enjoying this? This is not good. So I don't know that necessarily looking at Qui-Gon Jinn and saying he has a compelling arc when overall the film itself doesn't have much going for it is a great example. But I'm still trying to see the merit of your point. I'm not going to say that you can't have, and this goes part of, this kind of goes back to what I just rated it, right? I gave it a 4.4. Not an amazing rating, not a terrible rating, which goes to show that you can have a good setup, good characters, an interesting discussion, strong themes, and still have overall something that's enjoyable enough that I would be willing to give it kudos, right? But in regards to actual character development, I think the most compelling stories do have a degree of change, right? We at the end of the day we want to see people who transform and learn to be better. I think that is one of the most compelling aspects of a film. And so that is a reason that it has a whole section dedicated to it in the rating system, is because the idea that someone becomes better after going through a journey of difficulty is fundamental to the transformation that we as audiences want to see so that we can be inspired to change ourselves, right? To become better people in our own lives. And I don't know that. I think making the argument that Black has some even small degree of change when it comes to question his own motives and his own trust in God throughout this whole thing is perhaps more where I find the value of this film than necessarily the idea that there was no change and that's okay. All of that to say that maybe I don't disagree. I generally disagree. I think that you make an interesting point. And I think maybe if you have more examples or something else to further analysis to back up that claim, I could be compelled that maybe the idea that change isn't necessary for a story to be compelling might be plausible. But as of now, I'm not convinced.
I mean, I'm trying to think of side characters because that's more where you're gonna get it than having a. And I know you're gonna disagree with me about Marty McFly, so we wouldn't even go there. Um,
Yeah, because you'd be wrong.
okay, buddy. Okay. um, I think my point at the end of the day, like like with this movie specifically, is that this movie is ultimately a thought experiment, if you will. It is not a movie in the traditional sense that you think of one. Um, it is a completely different setting, and if you want to think about where this would fall in regards to an actual movie, this is more of a snapshot into the life of the character Black. And that's kind of how I would come at it if you're trying to look at it in this terms of like a story. I think if you look at it in terms of a snapshot in the life of White, it doesn't function as well, because this is the end for him. Like, this is just him. He has fully embraced his life as an atheist, the non-existence of a god in any way, shape, or form, and the total um, futility that comes with the struggle that is life. And that's what nihilism is. That's where you get Nietzsche. It's just we. There is no point. The struggle in life is pointless, and trying to accomplish anything in life is futile. You ought to just surrender yourself to the existence that you have. And once you finally do that, that is the only time you will ever find any sort of happiness. At least from what I understand. I'm probably going to be fact checked, but I'm not nihilistic, so it makes sense that I don't understand that worldview perfectly.
Sure.
Um, I do, in fact, have hope in life. As crazy as that sounds.
Contrary to
Um,
popular belief.
PSA: Andrew does have life and a reason to live, so we'll go with that. I forget where I was going with this point.
I mean, we could keep going back and forth on whether or
Oh,
not a
that's
character
what I
would
was. That's
resonate.
what I was saying. Um, this movie is a snapshot into Black's life, and I think that if you think about it like that, it may become a little more interesting because you have Black, who kind of in a way explains his story as a character throughout the movie, and you don't really get any of that description with White. You just have, oh, I'm a professor, I'm an atheist, I hate my life, I'm going to kill myself. With Black, you have, I'm an ex-con. I'm a horrible person. I bludgeoned a man's head in with a metal spike and almost killed him. I almost died myself. And then I became a Christian. And now I have hope in this life. And he's basically telling White, I was at the place where you were at. And you get this example of a character who's kind of at the end of his arc. And so, again, I'm not giving this movie full points for character development because I don't think it's really present within the movie itself, and I think the movie does need to be self-contained. Um, but I think this movie wasn't trying to do that, and so I'm trying to recognize the movie for what it is and what it tried to do. And so while I don't think that it's a movie in the traditional sense that it has a plot as we would think of it, I think it definitely has interesting elements that are being explored in its own right. And I think this goes back to the Joker 2 movie. It tried to do something different. And while I don't think it worked perfectly, I think it still does have things that go for it. Whereas the Joker 2 was just a movie that tried different things and fell flat on its face. So
We're not going there. I'm refusing to give that any more showtime. The whole yeah, I mean, well, just in regards to White, I actually think that that's not entirely accurate to say that he doesn't have much of a background in this film, simply because they do go into some aspects of it, right? Like, he didn't go to his father's bedside when he had cancer, and he intentionally chose not to because he didn't want to face that, right? Or the idea that he doesn't have good friends, and he actually despises all of the people he works with because all of those people are people that he considers are leeches in society to some degree, right? Who aren't they're disingenuous and terrible people, right? And he's very judgmental of the world and to some degree of his own actions as well. But I think you get a pretty cohesive snapshot of, well, not to the same degree with him compared to Black. You still get a pretty strong idea of who he is and the kind of life he lives. And from someone who's looking on the outside to hear White go, oh, I'm considering suicide and the world is falling apart. And then also here, I don't visit my father when he's at his last breath, and I don't have friends, and I despise the people I work with. It's like, well, no wonder you want to kill yourself. Everything about your life sounds awful, and you've built it that way because you think that that's how life ought to be. And that
Yeah.
you're, in some ways, I don't know, nobler because you do it that way, but not even that, because you don't believe you're noble. You simply believe the world is in an anarchic state. So it's not any better or any worse with you in it. It just is, and it's awful.
Phrase what I said earlier. I think that Black as a character has a backstory that explains his arc. White as a character, I do not think has a backstory that gets flushed out that explains how he got to where he is. It explains where he is and the things that he's done in his life. But even in the movie, Black asked him early on, was there something special about today? Why take your life today? And White says, there's nothing special about today. I mean, it's my birthday, but there's nothing special about that day in my mind. And he says, oh, well, happy birthday, Professor. And he's like, I literally couldn't care less. Um, and so White as a character, you get lots of instances where he explains the things that he's done that are influenced by his very nihilistic worldview. But Black as a character, his story is more of an arc, if that makes sense. Whereas White's story is more of just kind of a plateau. It's I am nihilistic, and these are the things that I do as a nihilistic individual. Whereas Black's story is I was without hope. I was without a God. I was where you're at, and this is what I did with my life. And now I'm not at that place, and here's how I got to where I am now.
Yeah, and I guess that makes more sense, and I could come to agree with that because even with his backstory of his father, right, that he gives in the middle of the film, that doesn't give you an answer to why is he nihilistic, right? Why didn't he go to his father's bedside when his mother asked him to, right?
Mhm.
And it was clear at that point that he was already at the stage where he was nihilistic and was not, and in some ways despairing of life even then.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that that's fair that you don't have that to the same degree with White compared to Black. Yeah, I think that's a compelling case.
And I think that one of my main because when I'm thinking about characters, I think what motivates this character first and foremost, or regardless of the arc, regardless of anything, in order for a character to be compelling, first and foremost, I think they need to have good motivations for why they
Hmm.
do what they do.
Right.
And I think with White, while they give him motivation in the sense that he has no reason to live, they don't give you a compelling reason as to why he's at that point in his life. What has driven this man to the point where he is the type of person who commits suicide and has no regrets afterwards?
Hmm.
Because he will
Right.
run back to that train as soon as he gets the next opportunity. What has
Hmm.
caused him to lose all hope in life? Because I think we can all agree no child is born nihilistic.
Right.
Children have this like bright-eyed idealistic idea of what their future will be like, and they get to the point of nihilism because of the circumstances in their life that drive them to that. They lose a loved one, or they're abandoned by their father, or they are, to get graphic here, they are molested at a young age. Like there are things that happen to them that completely change the way that they view the world. And so we don't get any of that with White. We just get this is how the world is. And while maybe there are some people that can just come to that conclusion, and while I agree that I think this movie is pretty spot on with the ultimate termination of the idea that there is no God, does result in the logical conclusion of, well, why not just take your own life then? What is the
Hmm.
point of living if there is no God? If we just happen to be at the certain stage of evolution where we are cognizant of the fact that we have no reason for living, why keep living? What's the point?
Hmm.
Um,
Right.
even though there are certain people that are, say, atheist and have come to that conclusion, they still continue to live. And so I think my biggest problem with White's character, and probably my biggest problem with the movie as a whole, is that he doesn't have a motivation for being as nihilistic as he is.
Yeah, and I think that that's fair. I think that makes it more uh, makes more so a case for Black being the main character. And it's kind of splitting hairs a little bit to some degree in this film. But I think
Yeah.
it's relevant, right? Because within the two characters, I mean, they get all the screen time, right? It's two characters, you get all the screen time. They're interacting dynamically. It's all in one room. They're really discussing this issue and all the facets around it, surrounding and relating to their lives and to their current actions and all of that stuff. So, yeah, uh, yeah, I think that that's definitely fair. What are your thoughts on how the film terminates and the lasting impact of a film like this? I mean, it's been around for what 13 years now, so it's been around for over a decade. But it's do you see? I mean, I haven't really heard about much about it before watching it myself. What are your thoughts on it?
In terms of lasting impact, there are very few people I've met that have seen this movie. Um, while I wouldn't say it's a movie in the traditional sense, this is still a movie that I would recommend, at least to adult audiences. I think it's worth watching. Does that mean that it has a plot and it's a movie in the traditional sense? No, but I think documentaries are worth watching too. So, um,
I
my
mean, you could
point.
watch Band of Brothers or something like that, and that's still documentary-esque, but interesting.
Yeah, and I think that it portrays a good message and it's thought provoking. Um, One thing I think that's interesting about this movie in terms of how it terminates is the question of what are we watching? And on its face, okay, well, hear me out. On its face, this movie appears to be pretty straightforward. Black is an average working class citizen who saved White, who was trying to commit suicide. And the assumption that we all have is they are both on the mortal plane in this movie. But from what I understand, there are plenty of ways of taking this film, and one of the ways you can take it is White is already dead. He did succeed in committing suicide, and Black is trying to save his soul. He is trying to save him from falling into the depths of hell, and it's not really a very Christian interpretation of how, like the afterlife works, but that I don't think that was necessarily the intent of the author per se, and I could be wrong. I haven't looked into that a ton,
Sure.
but the fact remains that that is a way of interpreting it. And when you think about it, if you listen to the audio in the movie, I think it's very interesting because one, there will be times where you hear a train whistle, and it's like, why are we hearing a train whistle in an apartment building? And you could say, well, maybe there's a train outside, but when you think about the fact that he was hit by a train, there's some stuff there. But two, the apartment building in a way is meant to be the underworld, if you will. And that's why you hear screaming and crying and chaos. And it's a very dark place that he is in, this apartment with Black. Um, and when he leaves the apartment, that's him descending to the depths of hell, pretty much. Um, I'm not saying that is the way that the movie ought to be taken. I just think it's interesting that there are elements within the movie that allow it to be interpreted in that way.
Yeah.
Um,
And you could even see, like, I tried very hard to not go into interpretations for the sake of anyone being able to see and enjoy this plot, right? But even just watching it as a casual viewer, I was able to identify immediately that there is definitely an element where the film itself brings into question if Black is a real character, right? Where White asks, like, are things about angels and about, I didn't see you at the train station when I jumped. Like, how were you there? I
exactly.
checked, and things like that, right? So it brings into this idea that, oh, maybe he wasn't there to begin with, or maybe he just appeared out of nowhere as a messenger from God, or maybe it is the afterlife. There's any number of ways that could be interpreted based on that single discussion, because then he goes, Oh, I didn't bring up angels. You brought up angels. It's like, well, do you believe in angels? No, I don't believe in angels. What do you believe in, right? And they lead into a whole different discussion, right, from there.
Yeah,
But there's definitely a lot of ideas in that could be interpreted in a much more, I guess, world-changing aspect of this film, right? If you say Black is an angel, then that does interpret a whole lot of different things in a new light. So,
yeah.
anyways,
I
go
do
ahead.
think, in terms of themes, one of the reasons I very much like this movie is because I think it does give a very good, accurate depiction of where nihilism ultimately leads someone, where
Mhm.
true atheism leads you. And true atheism will lead you to a nihilistic worldview. Um, I know people. There are those who would argue that true atheism doesn't make you necessarily completely nihilistic. I would fundamentally disagree with them, though.
Mhm.
The idea that there is no God, that the humanity has no creator, there is no divine being that rules over the universe, it does take away the meaning that life can carry. And I think all questions, all worldviews do boil down to the question: does God exist? Or
Mhm.
does a creator exist? Whether or not it's the God of the Bible, the question of is there a God is a fundamental question to who you are as a person and how you live your life. And the fact that black and white disagree on that one question alone is what makes this movie very interesting to me, is because
Mhm.
you get to diametrically opposed worldviews. And the thing is they never come to an agreement because they fundamentally disagree on the existence of a god. And so Black is never going to convince White that he ought not to kill himself unless he can convince him that God is real. And that is his struggle throughout the entire movie, is to convince him that there is indeed this God that exists. And there's so much dialogue there that happens, right? He Black asks him, "Do you talk to this God? Do you hear him?" And Black says, "No, I not in the way that you and me are sitting here talking, but he still does communicate to me." And so at the end of the day, he's never going to convince him that God exists, and that's why White ultimately finishes this movie by leaving the building.
Yeah. No, and I think that that's very interesting, especially in light of the conclusions that Black tries to bring him to, right? Because at the very end of the film, he's talking about how at the end of the day, you don't know what's going to happen to you except for that death is inevitable, right? And what do you do with the time that is before you? You love your brother next to you, and that is what you're supposed to do. You find every joy there. It says, what does it say? It says, hold on, I'm going to bring it up real quick. The shadow of the axe hangs over every joy. Every road ends in death. Every friendship, every love, torment, loss, betrayal, pain, suffering, age, and dignity, hideous, lingering illness, and all of it with a single conclusion for you and everyone and everything you have ever chosen to care for. This is the true brotherhood, the true fellowship, and everybody is a member for life. You tell me that my brother is my salvation? My salvation? Then damn him in every shape and guise and form. Do I see myself in him? Yes, I do. And what I see sickens me. Do you understand me? Right? And there's this discussion about like the meaning and finding meaning in the midst of death. And um the thing is that he doesn't. He's like, no, this sickens me to see this, and I don't like this. No, this is like, and I think that that's where you come to these diametrically opposed worldviews. Where in the one case, um, Black looks at the uncertainty in life and finds some level of hope in the midst of darkness, right? And you see that in how he's willing to help the um, poor people that are on the streets and invite them into his home to sleep while they might steal his stuff, right? And other such actions like that, versus White, who goes, all of society is crumbling around me and all I see is darkness. And you
Yeah.
see that both people are living in the same world, right? Both are living in a dark, terrible place where there isn't a lot of hope. But the difference is that Black chooses to look at the hope and to help his brother, right? To help the poor person around him. And White looks at the world around him and sees the evil, chooses to hate the people around him, and chooses suicide.
Yeah. And I think, again, it goes back to their belief. Does God exist or does he not? And I think one of my favorite moments in this movie is right towards the end when White just lays it so plainly out for Black right before he leaves the building. And I have the script here. He says, "I do not believe in God. Can you understand that? Look around you. Can you see? The clamor and the din of those in torment has to be the sound most pleasing to his ear. And I loathe these discussions. The argument of the village atheist whose single passion is to revile endlessly that which he denies the existence of in the first place. Your fellowship is a fellowship of pain and nothing more. And if that pain were actually collective instead of simply reiterative, then the sheer weight of it would drag the world from the walls of the universe and send it crashing and burning through whatever night it might yet be capable of engendering until it was not even ash. And justice, brotherhood, eternal life, good God, man, show me a religion that prepares one for death, for nothingness. There's a church I might enter. Yours prepares one only for more life, for dreams and illusions and lies. If you could banish the fear of death from men's hearts, they wouldn't live a day. Who would want this nightmare if not for fear in the next? The shadow of the axe hangs over every joy, every road ends in death. And you read that part. But he very clearly lays out the fact that I do not believe God exists. Because of that, I don't believe there's an afterlife. You live a life that prepares you for this next life. I don't believe a next life exists. Why should I be preparing for that then? Why ought I to treat my brother in such a way? Why ought I to love my brother? I ought not to, because there's nothing that commands me to do so. It gains me nothing other than friendship. But what is friendship? Why ought I to care about it when it gets me nothing in the afterlife? It gets me some instant gratification, but I can get better instant gratification by just living by myself. But at the end of the day, why ought I to gratify myself anyways? What is the point in all of this? There is no point. I ought
Right.
to just kill myself.
Right. Yeah, and that's a pretty succinct way that he comes to that conclusion. And if you walk down that path, it makes sense that he came to that conclusion. Yeah, it's very interesting. What are your thoughts on the impact to audiences from watching that and going through that journey, if you will, in this film?
I think this film can do a couple of things. One, I think it causes the viewer to interrogate these questions. And ultimately, the question they ought to come from this movie asking themselves is there a God? And I think, and I've had this discussion with multiple people, and there's the view that we ought not to ask ourselves these questions. Say, as Christians, we ought not to question, does God exist? I would disagree, and I think that asking yourself the question, does God exist, even as a Christian, is a very valid one to ask, because you are operating and functioning as a human being, and the entirety of your life and all the decisions you make stem from the belief that this God does indeed exist. And so asking yourself the question, is he real, is a very valid one to ask. And do I think that you ought to dwell on this question day and night as a Christian? No, I don't think it should plague your very existence. I, as a Christian, have come to the conclusion that this God does exist, and that's how I'm going to live my life. But I think that this question is definitely one that ought to be asked by every person at some point in their life, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that this movie does a very good job of helping the audience to parse out what does it mean depending on the answer you come to. With Black, the answer he came to was yes, God does exist, and despite the fact that my life sucks, and he's very open about this. I don't have a wife, I don't have kids, I have nobody. But what I do have is my brother on the street. I have the homeless man. I have the widowed mother. I have these people that I can help bring joy to. I have these people I can help out. I have you. And he says it at the end. He says, Who's my brother? And he says, Your brother? Yes. Is that why I'm here in your apartment? No, but it's why I am. And so he Black has come to the conclusion that even though I don't have anyone myself in terms of family or friends, I have the other people on this earth put here by God that I can help out. And that's why I'm here. And White has given himself the answer that God doesn't exist, and the ultimate termination of that belief is I ought to kill myself. And it's a very scary world to live in. And I think it serves as a warning to people too. Is like we ought like the existence of God is not an existence that makes us kind of it's not a bad existence, because I think often that's what many people come to the conclusion of is, if God exists, then oh, it's so bad because we have to follow all of these rules, and it means I can't do this or I can't do that. When really the existence of God is an existence of hopefulness. It's an existence where we can live, and we can live through the trials and the tribulations that we are hit with as people on this earth, and yet we can push through it, and we can do so with a joyful attitude. To a whole theological discussion, because we're discussing a movie, but I think this movie does present the opportunity to have that real thought process and that discussion for those who do watch it.
Yeah, and I think that it's a legitimate conclusion to come to about how this film terminates itself, right? What are the pervading worldviews of this, and how do those lead people to consider their lives, right? And how they should live or die based on that. So it's definitely a worthy discussion, and the film definitely opens that up for people to have. Yeah, that's a really good spot, I think, to end it.
Yeah.
Do you have any other last thoughts you want to leave the audience with, or is that pretty buttoned up?
I do want to end with this, because I wanted to say this before we finished. I think a lot of popular Christian media um, tries to do what this movie does. It tries to kind of have a Christian message within it, but I think it does it in a very poor way. I think this movie, and one of the reasons I gave it more points, despite the fact that it's very lacking in terms of like a plot, is that it has a message that I think many people need to hear, and we need to question: does God exist? How ought we to live our lives? What decisions ought we to make when walking down the street, when we see a homeless person, someone who's in need, someone who we could be helping?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, despite the fact that this movie doesn't really have a plot, I think it mm, in a very effective way does portray that message of the existence of a God. Whereas you get movies like, I mean, no shade to like the Kendrick brothers, but their movies aren't exactly the pinnacle of storytelling. And
Oh
so
boy.
you end up, and I think it's interesting because you ask yourself, why do those movies do so poorly? I think, simply put, is because they're shoving something down your throat. They are shoving a message down the audience's throat. And it's the exact same reason I hate Disney movies now, because they do the same thing. They shove an idea or a theme down your throat. And it's like, I don't want this. I want a story. And despite the fact that this movie, all it is the discussion of a theme, you as the viewer do not feel that it's being shoved down your throat. You don't feel like your mouth is being wrenched open, a funnel's being stuck down there, and you're chugging in a gallon of wokeness. You're able to digest it in such a way that's palpable.
And they don't do it in a weak way either, right? They fully explore these, and to a certain sense in which, and this was something I just realized having gone through this discussion, is that there is a certain sense in which they make the argument for the atheist viewpoint stronger than the argument for the Christian viewpoint. And you see that in the discussions, right? Even with the Christian at the end, where Black goes, "Oh, why couldn't I be as eloquent as him? Why couldn't I have the words to say?" And he didn't have it. And White did. White had the answer to everything. And that's why he was so persistent to get out of there, because he had the answers that Black simply did not have. But at the end of the day, even though he had strong arguments, his worldview was one of death, and it didn't
Yeah.
lead to good places. And I think that's a whole interesting discussion for itself. But I mean, suffice it to say, I think we've had enough of a discussion here, so that's left for you guys to ponder as you finish up this listen, because we are done. That's it. That's the pod. We hope you all enjoyed. We will be back, as we always are, next week, and we hope to see you all then.